There we are. Okay, welcome to the Dali Museum tonight. Tonight we are in part 4 of a 5-part conversation that initiated back in January and will finish next month. Every, second Thursday of the month, we've been presenting this, and today we are at part 4 of the Dali Condensed conversation. Tonight we're focusing on 1948 through 1964. So this would be the Dali as mad scientist period of his life. And essentially the goal of this was to share with all of you information that is shared with our docents in the 17-week docent program that happens at the beginning of most falls, and condense it down to 5 solid chunks of information, hopefully within 60 minutes or less. That said, I think I've already run over, not last time, but the time before. Chances are tonight be maybe a little bit longer than 60 minutes as well. I will try to keep it relatively tight and concise, but there's a lot of things that happened between 1948 and 1964. And I think probably the best way to describe this period of time is, unlike, say, the Surrealist period or even the Madrid years, there's less anecdote and a lot more actual artwork to talk about. And I know many of you have heard about art paintings, which form a big part of that, but also there's a number of other really key works that are part of this 16-year period that I'm going to touch upon tonight. So tonight what we're going to be talking about and looking at are Dali's return to Spain, the return to order, essentially classicism, and how that affects his work, certainly Catholicism, which will inform every aspect of what we're looking at tonight, the term Dali kind of links all these ideas together under, which is nuclear mysticism. We're going to look at a lot of large canvases. This is the period of the large canvas. We're going to see a little bit of math, unfortunately. We are going to hear a little bit about the Last Supper and perhaps look at some jewels along the way. So this is a pretty concise period of time. This is really the period of time that coincides with Dali's return to Spain and kind of reinvention of himself. And just prior to returning to Spain, Dali published this book, which in a way informs all of the years that we're going to be looking at, The 50 Secrets of Magic Craftsmanship. This is where Dali deliberately turns back to the Renaissance and looks to the great artists, Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and starts reading a lot of the textbooks associated with those artists, trying to really understand what they were trying to accomplish and apply it to his work in this kind of post-surrealist period of his career. Also, just prior to returning to Spain, this wonderful photograph was taken. And I know I showed this last month as the ending photo, I believe, for the 1940s when Dali was in the United States. But in a way, this captures Dali's goals and ambitions for the next decade. This is one of the most well-known of Philippe Halsman's photographs. It's certainly sort of the centerpiece of the Jump book and the whole Jump project that the photographer Halsman was associated with. He and Dali had a 37-year relationship, almost every year doing a photo project. And we're going to see a couple of examples of what comes out of that through these years. But certainly this idea of Dali being part of a disconnected series of objects that are floating and held in some sort of suspension, that description applies to the paintings that Dali will start creating in the 1950s. And as I said, this is really about the return to the homeland. So for 8 years, Dali has been basically trapped in the United States. The war raged on, and then after the war, things were so difficult and so much in shambles, it would have been very difficult for he and Gala to relocate back to his homeland. But one of the things that becomes most clear when you look at the 1940s is how much Dali missed the area that he grew up in, the area that he put down his roots, and that informed all of his artwork and his insights. And so there was this kind of hunger to return to Spain at all costs. So in 1948, the opportunity finally arrives. Dali and Gala return to Portlagat, Cadaqués, Figueres, and this whole area of the Catalan region that he had originally called home and would call home from this point forward. The villa is probably the most outstanding icon of that experience. Dali's villa, which is now a museum in Portlagat, was originally started by Dali and Gala purchasing a fishing shack. and then purchasing the next fishing shack and connecting them, and then another fishing shack and connecting them. So in 1948, Dali purchased, I believe, the bottom shack down here, which eventually was turned into a studio, and also an upper area shack up here. So they really completed the project of the purchases in 1948 to 49, and this is when Dali was working with the architect, who I believe was also the mayor of Port Legat, to complete this project and turn it into what's now become one of the really most interesting house museums over in Europe. So if you get a chance to go, you absolutely must visit Dali's villa. And in 1948, Dali really is reunited with his family for the first time since the expulsion of 1930. In 35, there was a brief reconciling between Dali and his father, and there was some short-lived alliances, but by 1940, he didn't see his father or sister again for another 8 years. So he returns home, he sees his father. His father has become a Catholic, and if you remember back, his father had been an outspoken atheist. The war changed his mind and his feeling about Spain, and his father was actually pro-Franco. So, and a lot of that has to do with the story associated with his sister, where the sister was possibly raped by communist Spaniards during the war, which led to this rethinking of his affiliation. But this seems like a very happy homecoming. It seems like a very positive step towards seeing a new future in his homeland. All things seem very good. Even Gala is welcomed into the family. But of course, not all good things last forever. And by 1950, Dali's sister, Ana Maria, publishes a book called Salvador Dali as Seen by His Sister. And it's a book that's relatively straightforward. Talks about how Dali was a spoiled child, but given to great fantasy, how he was an upper middle class child who had a lot of benefits that he took advantage of. He was definitely a tantrum thrower. But essentially what she does is she talks about Dali as a person, which is exactly how he does not want to be described. He had spent a great deal of time working on The Secret Life of Salvador Dali, his autobiography, which we are going to be reading during a readathon, a 24-hour readathon on Dali's birthday, May 10th and 11th. So if you're around, we hope you'll join us for that. But he spent a lot of time in that book deliberately creating a faux autobiography, an autobiography filled with misinformation and crazy stories and incredible, vivid images that probably were not true and that he himself would have admitted as such. But as soon as Ana Maria says that is a completely misleading book, here's the true story, Dali was outraged. And the very first thing he did was publish a small kind of greeting card that dismissed in every way, shape, and form anything she wrote and basically disowned her as being his sister. And he gave this to everybody and anybody he would encounter. So he was suddenly on an ad campaign to basically disabuse anybody of possibly purchasing her book, reading it, or trusting any of the straightforward stories that she shares about his youth and the way he had been. So this once again puts a nail into the relationship with the family, and Dali's father, shortly thereafter, winds up passing away. He dies on September 12th, and very I guess expectedly, in the last accounting, Dali's father, the lawyer, the notary, who had constantly written his son in and out of the family will back and forth over and over again, finally, the last will and testament leaves nothing to Dali. So everything from Salvador Dali Cusi goes to his daughter. So it's a very sort of telling family homecoming where it wasn't all as good as it could have been. This, though, does correspond to Dali's new obsession with visual imagery. And as I said, he's going back to the Renaissance. So one of the pieces that he idolizes and really talks about in great detail is Raphael's Alba Madonna, which he says is the most perfect or most beautiful image of perfection that could possibly have been created. So for him, Raphael is the height of visual beauty and visual harmonies. I think as an artist, Dali is more drawn to Leonardo da Vinci, but in terms of verbal praise, he's really focusing on Raphael as being the absolute master of true harmonious beauty. And the first outcome of this, a painting that really is radically different than anything he had accomplished in the United States, is Leda Atomica, where Dali looks to the story of Leda and the Swan. And here we have the swan coming to visit Leda. But the thing that's really unique about this painting that's quite different than the American work is that nothing touches anything else. Everything is suddenly set into motion and floating. It's all harmonious, it's all quite beautiful, almost in the same way the arrangement of the album Madonna had that same sense of beauty. But here, everything floats completely distinct from the object that it's connected with. So she's floating, the swan is floating, they're not touching one another. The objects around them, such as this ruler over here to the side, some of the shells, everything is suddenly caught in suspension. And the idea here is, again, this kind of nuclear mystical idea that the world on a subatomic level is made up of particles that are constantly in motion, held in suspension, more space around them than substance, and yet at the same time everything coheres into a very harmonious view. So he's creating a visual metaphor for that concept. And the thing that's quite interesting at this point is that he has made a very major transition from surrealism, and yet he has not abandoned the idea of symbolic language. I think when we think of surrealism, we think of, what does the great masturbator symbolize? Well, it's a portrait of the self and portrait of sexual anxiety and all these fears of castration. And, there are specific symbols such as the grasshopper or the lion that we know how to read because of the way Dali has written about them. But it's symbolic thinking. What happens in 1948 to 49 is that Dali replaces Freudian symbolism with Catholic symbolism. And suddenly he has a completely coherent alternative language that he can use that provides almost the same sort of ability to quickly maneuver one idea to another idea and have a universal audience able to read what it means. So when we work with the Madonna, there are associations we have with the Madonna. When you look at the scallop shell or the egg that's suspended here, you go right back to Piero della Francesca and the idea of the unity of the world and the unity of the universe in this kind of mystical arrangement of objects. So he's using another symbolic language that's even more universal than Freudian symbolism. He's also responding to what's happening in the environment around him. So of course, action painting, abstract expressionism, this is what's happening. And artists, following the dropping of the atomic bomb, felt that representational imagery had somehow seemed inappropriate as a way of addressing mankind in the way that we had found ourselves in this kind of post-atomic world. So the approach of people like Jackson Pollock to look at process rather than representational imagery seemed to many to be the appropriate response, that seemed to be the art that addressed the times. Well, of course, Dali is a reactionary artist, and that's first and foremost his way of operating. And so what he does is, instead of embracing process, he goes back to the 19th century, to the history of monumental canvases. These were the canvases that would have been created to be purchased by the government, the big mega statements, the pieces that you wanted to have in the salon to be sold to the French government to be placed in a large area of commerce. And this is a very typical one. This is from the d'Orsay collection. It's Theodore Chassereau, The Romans of the Decadence. Very typical painting, huge, about 14 to 15 feet across, filled with all of these people just luxuriating, obviously given over to the senses. And of course, the sly bit is that every face in here was a political figure of the time. So that was actually quite shocking in that context. But what Dali liked about this was this kind of uber perfectionism, the academicism that's driving these kind of paintings. And he decides that he's going to take the opposite path and not only paint representational imagery, but go to incredibly large canvases and just fill them with as much representational imagery as he can possibly manage. So the first canvas that begins this process is the Madonna of Port Legat. And as I said, this begins a whole tradition of large canvases. And he paints almost one large canvas per year. And if you can think about it, the pattern starts to become, in the fall, there's going to be an exhibition in New York City. That will be the place where these pieces will be shown. Dali will start thinking about the show in the fall. He'll start doing sketches, start writing in his journal. By the spring, when he goes to the Hotel Maurice in Paris, he will start making contracts and thinking about what the summer's going to bring. Every summer he goes to Port Legat. That's when he puts together the fall show. And there's usually anywhere from 10 to 15 paintings plus one large canvas. And that becomes almost the pattern every year, more or less from 1949 through about 1970. So we're going to see some of those key pieces here tonight. The term Dali masterwork, which is what we usually use for them, was coined by the gentleman who started our collection, Reynolds Morse. He wrote a book called The Masterworks, and basically he came up with a very simple definition, and it's still useful. He said that for a painting to be a Dali masterwork, it had to be at least 5 feet in one or both dimensions, and it had to preoccupy Dali for about a year. And that's pretty accurate as a description for most of the works that we're going to be looking at. The problem enters when there's 2 large canvases in the same year. You know, if you really try to get down to specifics, there are perhaps 22 large canvases, but there's anywhere from 18 to 22, depending on how you define this process. The other slight problem is using the term masterwork instead of monumental canvas. It's a semantic one, but it does beg the question, well, is the small persistence of memory, is that not a masterwork because it's not included under this category or this terminology? So anyway, enough of that. We're going to look at some large canvases. And this gives you a sense of how Dali would construct them. He actually had a slit cut into his studio floor so he could raise and lower these canvases. He did have at least one assistant, and at times 2 or 3. The main gentleman who helped him was the Cid de Robea, who had done a lot of backdrops for Barcelona performances, ballet, theater, and so he started working for Dali. And also, these created new complications. For example, how do you get a large canvas up to your gallery in New York City, you know, when the elevators are obviously made for 6 foot or smaller? And so there was a lot of devices that had to be created and new problems. But this is the typical way that one of these large canvases will be brought into either the Keller Gallery or the Carstairs Gallery, wherever Dali was showing at that time. Leonardo da Vinci suddenly becomes very important to Dali. In particular, not only was da Vinci a master of seemingly all things, truly defining the idea of a Renaissance master, which I think is what Dali was trying to tongue-in-cheek create himself into for the 20th century, but also Leonardo da Vinci was a real master of mathematics. And mathematics had the incredible appeal of providing a sort of intellectual beauty to match the physical beauty of something like a Raphael painting. If you understand the application of something like the golden section in relation to the arrangement of figures, there's a certain intellectual beauty that's very abstracted, but also complements the experience of the visual sensuality. And so the appeal of Leonardo da Vinci is that he gave himself over to mathematics, and he actually had his own mathematician, a man named Luca Pacioli. And for a particular gathering of Pacioli's work on three-dimensional objects in geometry, Leonardo was the first artist to actually create three-dimensional drawings of these, all these different types of solids. And so it was the first time artists could actually see something abstract like this in a three-dimensional presentation. And it just, in some ways, turned the world on its ear. It suddenly raised the bar for what an artist had to be able to create to an extremely high level. And he learned it by having his own mathematician. And what this is leading to is the fact that in 1946, Dali met at a party a gentleman named Attila Gica. And Attila Gica was a Romanian prince. He was also a diplomat. He was a variety of different things, historian, mathematician. But he was teaching math at and aesthetics at the University of San Diego at the time. And they struck up a relationship that became a pretty strong one. And for about the next 10 years, Dali, in a sense, had access to this great mathematical mind. And the application that Gica had was to the real world outside. He was fascinated by the world of art and, more importantly, to nature and how there were mathematical formulas that could always be perceived in the natural surroundings. And so his philosophy was that any understanding of mathematics can do nothing more than make the artist more precise and give him more opportunity and more ways of thinking about a problem and resolving it. So he felt that by an artist learning this type of approach to geometry, it would give them an infinite number of ways of resolving problems that would have been much more simple prior to this, but also much more unsatisfying. So the golden ratio, just the idea is relatively simple until you get into all the permutations, but if you take a line, there's a place where you can divide that line such that the longer line to the larger part of it that's been divided is exactly the same as the larger part in relation to the smaller part. So A plus B, which is the long line itself, divided by this part, that's here, is exactly the same proportion as this part divided by this. And the reason all that's important is because it becomes a number that's noticed over and over and over again in nature. It's an irrational number known as phi, and it becomes, to Dali, like this mystical key to the universe. It starts appearing throughout painting after painting after painting in Dali's work. It relates to these mathematical proportions that we're all familiar with, the nautilus shell, and the way that this logarithmic spiral has this kind of natural growth proportion. And it's really it's the mathematics of growth, a living kind of mathematics, how the ear of a baby inside the womb proportionally grows without becoming suddenly much bigger than the rest of the body as time passes. It's the way things proportionally stay in relation to one another, despite the fact that we're getting larger or the world is somehow changing. So this is the golden ratio, or in this case, the golden rectangle, and this is actually called the golden spiral. So all of these things become available to Dali between 1948 and 1954, and he starts really applying them in his paintings. He also, this is a very good example of where, from the book that Madalagika published, you can see how he applies these ratios to growth proportions and to the human face. And he does the same thing with plant forms and also with things like the Acropolis and the Parthenon. You know, the golden ratio informs all things that seem to us to be pleasing and proportionally appropriate. Which brings us to Dali, and not just math, but also religion. This is the study for the Madonna of Port Legate. You can see a lot of the same elements that are in the completed form. It's in the Milwaukee Museum of Art, if you're ever up there at the University of Milwaukee. Dali actually brought this to a meeting he arranged with the Pope, which is Pope Pius XII, and he had it blessed. So the thing that's really interesting about this is Dali truly, at his fundamental core, is a non-believer. But he wants to be a believer. He wants to embrace Catholicism. He wants to have science prove to him what faith can't provide. And so there's many meetings with popes that we will see over this 10-year period for this strange non-believer who's painting all these religious works that are so embraced by Catholics around the world. And 1950, the Madonna of Port Legate, as I said, it's a very large canvas. It's about, I believe, 11 and a half feet tall. It's owned by a museum in Japan, but it has been on loan to the Atlanta Museum of Art a couple of years ago for the Late Works exhibition. And it starts this process, one large canvas per year, summarizing Dali's obsessions of the year. And one of the things, of course, that you notice right here that becomes a standard formula, Gala equals Madonna. Gala equals she who is the mother of Christ, and all of these curious attributes, which are quite interesting given what she was like as a person. But here we have Gala actually becoming almost like the tabernacle for the Christ child, who then becomes the tabernacle for the bread, which becomes the Eucharist through the sacrament that is really at the core of Catholic belief. And Dali says, the weaning of furniture nutrition, our painting upstairs from the Surrealist period, becomes sacred. Instead of the hole in my nurse's back, a tabernacle in the Virgin Gala, and another tabernacle containing the divine bread open in the body of Jesus. So Dali is very literally making these kinds of connections. He's also trying to paint as beautifully as Raphael while dealing with these more, I guess, post-atomic ideas of reality and nature. And also he's referring back to a lot of his earlier paintings, revisiting them from a different perspective. So this painting not only revisits the weaning of furniture nutrition, it also revisits the basket of bread from 1926. The idea of the transformation of the bread here being a staple of life, now it's become Eucharistic. And here's the obligatory publicity shot. We have a lot of these that I'll share as we go along. Dali pointing out to his wife, "Oh, did you know you're the tabernacle?" You know, these really just kind of, I love it's kind of the cocked, bullet pointing to what the important part is, but it gives you a sense of the dimension and also the sense that Dali really was a showman at this point. You know, showman and shaman might be a good way to put those two concepts together. But he definitely had a sense of showmanship, and he was trying to impress and, delight potential buyers. 1949 and 1953, Dali does some of the most memorable of his jewel creations. He was working with a gentleman named Alemany, Carlos Alemany, and his company that was located at the St. Regis Hotel, and they got together and came up with a really amazing idea. And the amazing thing is that it actually happened. Dali was interested in the Renaissance. Alemany was interested in producing some really interesting jewelry. Alemany said, if I can get some very unusual stones or pieces like that, maybe we could collaborate. And Dali was all over this. He loved the idea of an artist not only making fine art, but also making really extreme jewelry, almost like the royal crown jewels of England. And so this was one of the real successes. This, of course, is the Eye of Time, which was covered, dripping with diamonds and a working clock and this ruby right there in the center. And then, of course, in a way, the most fun of all, the ruby lips with the teeth of pearls, the brooch that we have copies of them out in the store, but 1949, 1950 is when a lot of these were made. And I love this photograph of the sort of Dali monster, this jewelry monster where the lips are in place and the eye is in place, and it's like right out of a creep show horror movie poster, which also corresponds with Dali's publication in 1951 of the Mystic Manifesto, the Manifeste Mystique, April 1941. For the first time in the history of science, physics was providing proof of the existence of God. This is a direct quote from the book. This gives you a sense of what's going on in Dali's mind. He's desperately hoping that science will provide the missing link between his lack of faith and a real belief and buy-in to the idea of Catholicism. He's having epiphanies based on trying to understand the cosmos or trying to understand the subatomic world, and yet there still seems to be a disconnect between that and a kind of true knowledge that there's a divine order to things. So it's almost like he's using that language to convince himself that this existence is there. 1951, Dali also gives a presentation on Picasso that becomes very memorable, and this gives you an idea why. He was in Madrid. He says, Picasso is Spanish, so am I. Picasso is a genius, so am I. Picasso is about 72 years old. I'm about 48 years old. Picasso is known in all countries around the world, so am I. Picasso is a communist, neither am I. And this becomes, in a way, the secret fortune cookie to understand why Dali remains in Spain and actually eventually becomes very close to Franco on some level, and why Picasso never steps foot ever again into the country of Spain, because Franco never leaves. Dali realized that the only way to stay in Spain would be to allow himself to become allied with Franco on some level. Franco controlled Spain. It was the iron fist. And if Dali wanted to live the way he wanted to live, and yet at the same time be able to go back and forth between America and Spain, he would have to be on Franco's good list. And it seems like the most important thing to Dali at this time is to be in Spain. And so he really starts working in a very complicated way into embracing monarchism and embracing the ideas of Velázquez and the court painter concept, as opposed to the modern communist fighting against the world in a kind of existential environment, which would be Picasso. And there is, hopefully, within the next 2 years, if everything comes to fruition, and there's a lot of difficulty, but we are planning a big show on Dali and Picasso. And there's a lot of work that's been done on it, a lot of work still to be done on it, but the plan is within the next 2 years there will be a Dali Picasso show that will start to reveal connections and disconnections between the two of them. It was said at the very end of his career, Picasso said he really was quite fond of Dali, but he never wanted to meet with him in the later period because Dali would use it for publicity purposes. And it's probably true. Probably Dali could not help but do that. But every year, Dali was writing postcards to Picasso all the way until he passed away. 1952, Dali paints the work that in a way is the summation of his religious pieces. This is the one that I think most people really resonate with. It's the Christ of St. John of the Cross, owned by the Glasgow Museum in Scotland. And it was inspired by a visit to a convent in Avia, Spain, and the priest or the cardinal who was there showed Dali a sketch that's very similar to this that was supposedly done by St. John of the Cross, one of the followers of St. Teresa. So a period of Catholic Spanish mysticism given to visionary capacities, given to visions and extreme, unusual experiences. He had the vision of Christ suffering on the cross as seen from God in heaven looking down. So a very physical idea of God overlooking the universe, looking down, seeing his son dying on the cross. Dali felt that this was very profound. It resonated with him. And then he had a dream. And he drew these two images to capture what happened in the dream. They're not martini glasses. They're actually an image of the Trinity. Dali says that in 1950, I had a cosmic dream in which I saw the colors of an image, saw in colors an image which in my dream represented the nucleus of an atom. The nucleus later took on a metaphysical sense that I considered the unity itself of the universe, the Christ. So he goes from the idea of nucleus to Christ being the center of all things, which would be probably over here, the unity. And then he goes on to say, when thanks to the instructions of Father Bruno, a Carmelite, I saw the Christ drawn by St. John of the Cross, I geometrically decided upon a triangle and a circle, which aesthetically summed up all the previous experiments, and I put Christ in that circle. So for him, this triangle with a circle in it becomes both an image of the atomic connection with the nucleus in the middle, but it also becomes the way to depict Christ that refers to St. John of the Cross, but also to his dream. And so here you have that looking down where the circle is in the middle of the triangle, and all of this is looking down into the Bay of Port Legat. So along with these religious feelings and dreams, Dali is also very interested in the flesh. And here we have the really wonderful 1951 photograph that Halsman and Dali worked on, which was the involuptate mors, or voluptuous death. And it's the idea of taking a group of naked women, arranging them around this particular construction so that Dali and Top Hat can be sitting next to both the voluptuous beauty of all the women, but also as a symbol of a skull, a representation of death with the two eye sockets and the teeth inside of the grinning mouth. So it's really very clever, and it's very much based on 19th century French postcards. But the poor women, their stories, I think it was like a 5 or 7 hour shoot. They said it was just very cold, really uncomfortable. They had to hold their pose for long periods of time. It just sounds like it was pretty grueling all around. And they only got paid like, I don't know, $10 a piece or something. It was the way things happened back then. That said, 1952 also corresponds with a very unique moment in Dali's life. Dali went on a lecture circuit in the United States talking about nuclear mysticism. The amazing thing about it, he was the #1 speaker that year throughout the United States. Tour circuits were very popular, and everybody went on the tour circuit talking at the local gymnasium or the church or the local library. Hundreds and hundreds of people would come out to these lectures, these public opportunities to hear different ideas and to meet different personalities. Dali was the personality in 1952. Unfortunately for Dali, he thought that the United States were like Europe, that you could just go from one state to the other in a matter of, a couple hours. And he had booked a tour that took him through like Idaho, down to Texas, over to Florida and back up. And at some point, he just gave up on the tour. It just was like this endless, endless drive to nowhere. And so the other notable thing about it is, of course, the very first lecture or two, Reynolds Morse, our collector, shared the stage with Dali. And this photo seems to capture pretty well the kind of lack of, I don't know if the word is lack of humility, that might be overstating it, but the sense of incredible confidence that Reynolds Morse had as a collector to speak openly about the artist who's right next to him. And here you can just imagine the elegies that are, that he's bestowing upon Dali. Dali seems somewhat surprised by what's being said. I don't know if that's the case, but I absolutely love this photo. It tells you so much about where our collection came from. This very, very powerful and self-confident collector. 1952, Dali also paints one of the real treasures of this period of time. It's the Galatia of the Spheres. This remained in Dali's collection, and it's now in the collection at the Foundation in Spain. And what he's done is he's formed his wife's image from what he would describe as corpuscles, particles, so that you see this perfect harmony of all of these different circles as they ascend back into space at this one particular point in the background, and yet each one has a particular detail that then brought together forms this incredibly beautiful portrait of her face. It's definitely one of Dali's high points of the nuclear mystical period. He also writes in the Mystic Manifesto that nuclear mysticism is the opposite of the atomic bomb. Instead of disintegration of matter, we have integration, the reconstruction of the real and glorious body of the Virgin in the heavens. And in 1954, Dali paints the Assumpta Lapis Lazulina, which is a great title, a lot of good words in there. It has Gala at the very top as the Madonna. Christ is here on the altar in the middle of her body. Her feet are down here. There's sort of a power cell down here that seems to be the propulsion core to the explosion. And there's all these rhino horns sort of flailing about her. And Dali has a great quote. He says, "The Virgin's assumption occurs not by the power of prayer, but by the power of her own anti-protons." There's not a better quote to summarize what Dali's nuclear mystical thoughts are. This is Catholicism combined with modern science. And so there's a kind of science fiction aspect to some of this work. But so she's drawn forward by her anti-protons into the heavens. Now, there's one interesting thing that happens, one interesting story that I guess you could associate with all of this interest in electrons and protons and neutrons. Dali's great translator, the gentleman who translated The Secret Life, The 50 Secrets of Magic Craftsmanship, Hidden Faces, all of these core books that we associate with Dali. His name was Hacken Chevalier, and he was a translator who actually taught out on the West Coast. The reason he's important to this part of the story, he was very close with Robert Oppenheimer. And Robert Oppenheimer, of course, associated with the whole Manhattan Project, the development of the nuclear bomb. It's very possible that Chevalier may have been a spy, and he may have coerced Oppenheimer to participate as a spy or to become a spy by sharing information about the atomic bomb with the Russians. Certainly when the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission had their hearing, Oppenheimer was stripped of his abilities to act as a free agent, and Chevalier lost his position, wasn't able to be hired in the States, and eventually wound up going back to France for the rest of his life. And the reason, of course, this is important is because he had constant contact with Dali throughout this whole period that he was friends with Oppenheimer. And it's very possible that Dali's ideas about nuclear science leading to nuclear mysticism were his own way of understanding the things that were shared with him from Hacken Chevalier by way of Robert Oppenheimer. So there's like some really pretty heavy connections here leading right into Dali during one of the most important transformations in his career. So the question is this the way that Dali got his information about this, or was it strictly through reading Scientific American and some of the more popularist notions of atomic energy? Not sure. 1953, Dali creates probably the most interesting of all of his jewelry sculptures. This one's called the Royal Heart. And what makes this so interesting is not only does it clearly, pay tribute to the idea of the royal crown jewels, but it also has a red ruby heart inside of the gold heart that has a mechanism that makes it look like it's beating like a human heart. So the rubies are beating, and it's very creepy. It should probably be known that all of these jewels are now owned by the foundation. If you have a chance to go to Figueres, you will see the full collection, which I believe is 43 objects. So there was a long and regulated kind of a participation as a jeweler on Dali's part, working with Alemany and Company. And the foundation, fortunately, has come into ownership of almost all of them. So you can go and see the collection, which is pretty remarkable. At one time, it was called the Owen Cheatham Collection. Prior to that, it was the Catherwood Collection. And if you have perhaps parents who were aware of Dali, they may have told you about the traveling show that they saw of Dali's jewels. It seemed to go everywhere, raising money for a couple charities during the late 50s and early 60s. 1954, Dali publishes the Dali Mustache book, which has given us what has become apparently the icon of Dali for the universe and the world forever forward. I think there have been 4 exhibitions now in the last 4 to 5 years. Every exhibition has bought this particular image to be their symbol of Dali, so including the Madrid show that's coming up, the Pompidou show that just happened, the Atlanta show, and even as far back as the Philadelphia show in 2004. So this image of Dali for the world is the image, and it was captured by Philippe Halsman. But the real beauty of the book, of course, is that there is such a great, robust enthusiasm for this idea that Dali's mustache has become, for the world, the symbol of the artist. That these are just a couple of the pages, but you can see this is the question about, what's the mystery behind the Mona Lisa smile? And of course, it's the money that Dali makes all the time. There's a great question here. It's, Dali, why do you paint? And below it says, for the love of art. But of course, his mustache gives that away. This one here is Dali fishing for ideas, so his mustache becomes a fishing rod. Over and over again, there's all these really bad, simple puns that become so fun and so over the top. If you're looking for a good Christmas book, I recommend that to give to somebody. I think they'll appreciate it. 1954 also, Dali's looking back at his earlier career, really taking note of it. And so here we have our own disintegration of the persistence of memory, where Dali's showing how much his ideas have evolved since 1931, when he originally painted the work that the world really knows him for, the persistence of memory. And the new edition is basically the combination of Rhino Horns, which double as, I suppose, atomic bombs, and also the fact that everything is at this point disconnected and floating, but still in this kind of harmonious, uniform arrangement, so that the world is still contained in some sort of harmonious space, even though it's starting to disintegrate into smaller particles. Dali also paints this watch. It's called the soft watch at the moment of first explosion. And the interesting thing here is that when we originally thought of the soft watches, the idea of camembert was the term that Dali used to sort of describe them. This idea of something oozing and running and morphing into like a taffy type of structure. Here, the watch looks much more like it's become dipped into some very, very cold material, so that it's become brittle, almost like glass. And instead of melting, it seems to be shattering in front of us. So there also seems to be this new way of thinking about nature that's now changed into a much more fragmented type of structure. There's another crucifixion painted in 1954. This one, the Corpus Hypercube. It's in the Metropolitan Museum's collection. And there's an interesting story associated with it. The gentleman who purchased it, Chester Dale, who was one of the great American collectors of the 20th century, was a great collector of Impressionism. He was going to give a gift to the Met of his collection of Impressionism, but when he saw this Dali painting, he absolutely and completely fell in love with it, purchased it right away, and made the condition that you will only get my Impressionist works if you take this work as well. So this is how this painting came into the Met's collection. And I should also mention, he's the same person who purchased the Last Supper. And the same stipulation applied to the National Gallery. So we're going to see that in a minute, but that painting also would never have been purchased in a million years by the National Gallery unless they were coerced into having to take it because there was Impressionist work attached. And the idea for Dali here is that this particular form, this hypercube, which is an 8-sided box basically, that Christ seems to float within, somehow this relates to the fourth dimension, that this is a mathematical expression of a dimension that's beyond our comprehension. This would almost be a 3-dimensional shadow into our world of a 4th-dimensional reality, which is where Christ is transferring to. And we had a gentleman here, Professor Lee Banshoff, who talked about Dali in the 4th dimension and Dali's interest in concepts like the 4th dimension and the mathematics of that. This, for Dali, was what he was responding to. For those of you who are familiar with this, this is the Isenheim altarpiece by Matthias Grunwald. It's perhaps the most painful of all the depictions of the crucifixion from the medieval and Renaissance periods. It was actually intended for a hospital that took care of people with skin diseases. And the idea was that Christ is suffering for our sins, and he's taken on everything that you're possibly suffering through, plus everything else. So he has a variety of skin diseases, there are bones piercing the flesh, everything about it is completely painful and horrific. And Dali decided that he would make the anti-Grunwald crucifixion. And so he actually has provided Christ to have this sort of superhero, stuntman kind of body, the build without any puncture, any piercing, any sort of disruption of anything other than beauty. And Christ is moving forward rather than suffering. So very consciously decided upon way of approaching this by Dali. And again, the publicity photo, Dali with the hypercube, dressed in a kind of large robe, looking somewhat mystical himself, like a guru. Dali also was sporting some rhino horns during this period of time. He was very given to what he called a rhinocerotic view of the world around him. Rhino horns are interesting things, as we all know. They can be ground down to be aphrodisiacs. They are actually not solid, but they're more like fingernails or hair. It's a material that just grows. But it actually grows in a logarithmic spiral shape, sort of like a nautilus shell. There's the Fibonacci patterning to the way it grows. Dali was fascinated by this. He was also fascinated by how the unicorn in the medieval period was associated with chastity, even though it seemed so phallic. He started talking about the rhino horn also being a symbol of chastity, while at the same time being used as an aphrodisiac and obviously having very phallic connotations. And he had the opportunity to do a copy of the Lacemaker. His favorite artist in the world is Vermeer. He is the highest scoring artist in his chart of artists. I think he only missed by 1 point a perfect score. Dali approached the Louvre, said he wanted to do a copy of the Lacemaker. What he actually created was, there was actually a perfect copy, but there was also this, which is the paranoid critical study of Vermeer's Lacemaker, where the Lacemaker becomes co-substantial with rhino horns. And so you can see her face sort of caught within all of these different rhino horns flying through space. And he said that there was a connection between the logarithmic spiral of the rhino horn and the original study by Vermeer. I had to make the Lacemaker explode with the form of rhino horns, these horns being the only ones in the animal kingdom constructed in accordance with the logarithmic spiral. As in this painting, it's the very logarithmic spiral that guided Vermeer's hand. So Dali also had a very great ability to take concepts that he was interested in that moment and apply them to anything he was interested in. So suddenly Vermeer is all about logarithmic spirals. There are other things about logarithmic spirals. This is a painting that's pretty well known amongst aficionados of erotica. This is a work that wound up in the Hugh Hefner collection, painted almost at the same period of time. Young virgin auto-sodomized by her own chastity. And here we have rhino horns, perhaps in a more not appropriate, but perhaps less exotic setting. This is perhaps where we expect to find them. And the thing that's most surprising and in some ways horrific is this is a portrait of Dali's sister from 1925. Clearly, she is the one he's thinking of in this depiction. It really is like this final, last smacking of his anger against her, so to speak. So it's a really powerful piece. It's somewhat personal, and it's also now associated with the Hefner collection, which it no longer belongs to. Also, in 1955, Dali starts to make a film that was abandoned later, but certainly there was a lot of filming done for it, The Prodigious Story of the Lacemaker and the Rhinoceros. And the mind reels thinking about what that possibly could have looked like. But here's one of the scenes where Dali is actually sitting on a wheelbarrow relating to the Malais Angeles in the zoo in Paris with the rhino in the background. 1955, same year, Dali does the Last Supper. And this is Dali's Last Supper, which is in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., down in the passage between the east and the west sections, very close to the water fountain. Not a very illustrious place for it to be seen, but nevertheless, it is able to be accessed by everybody. And what Dali has done is he's constructed the Last Supper in a way that's very similar to the Santiago El Grande above. It's symmetrical, and it's placed within a dodecahedron. So here's that sense of mathematics applied to sort of sorting out of how the modern version of the Last Supper needs to be depicted. It should be within a sort of a universal cosmic frame that goes back to Leonardo da Vinci and to the mathematics of ratios and proportion. And so a dodecahedron, of course, is a 12-sided form. This relates to the 12 apostles. It relates to the 12 months of the year. All of these different forms that Dali was really would resonate with him. And when we look at the differences between this and Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, the most important one is that for da Vinci, this was about human emotion. He was showing all of the different responses of the apostles in reaction to the statement that one of them would betray him and soon he would be crucified. And so you have all these different personal psychologies responding to the statement that's been made, and yet all of this has been placed also within this perfectly golden ratioed perspectival environment. Everything about this is the most modern, most controlled mathematical presentation that this particular subject has ever been presented in. Dali's, of course, becomes much more anonymous. All of the apostles become reflections of each other, and we don't see anybody's response whatsoever other than Christ himself, who again is sort of a superhero, stuntman kind of a presentation. Very beautiful, handsome gentleman, long hair. He's become translucent. We have the bread and the wine representing the body and the blood of Christ. He's looking up into the heavens. And here we have the apostles where you see they're just anonymous figures who need to be there as the dodecahedron does to represent a kind of numerical balance, but not to represent anything personal. The following year, Dali makes Nature More Vivant, which we have upstairs. This is the first of these large canvases where there is no explicit Catholic symbolism, even though it has the same sort of message of nuclear mysticism, a kind of religious experience, but no longer needing to have a particular Catholic theme. And this is a page from Attila Geica's book, The Geometry of Art and Life. It's not actually a golden rectangle, but it's based on the golden proportion. The reason this becomes important is because Dali had another engineer actually trace it out, apply it to the canvas he was working on, and this becomes the organizational principle behind the painting. Everything on this painting is constructed in relation to this golden ratioed grid. So we have the bottle following perfectly along this line. We have the knife following perfectly along this line. We have the table more or less contained within this portion of the inner rectangle. All of these different spaces are thought out in advance in order to create this kind of perfect harmony that Dali's looking for. Dali's also interested in Heisenberg. And at this point, he's interested in the difference between that the fact on a subatomic level, either something is a particle that can be located in space, or it's a momentum wave that has no position. And so what we have here, two fruit dishes. The one fruit dish is dividing amongst it's basically dissolving into space. It's very rapidly dissolving in a kind of logarithmic spiral. It casts no shadow. but the fruit dish that's right here that looks very much like a photograph of one, there's a shadow actually being cast on the table below it. So it's the same fruit dish, one has momentum, the other has location. So he's creating these visual metaphors for rather complicated ideas, but he feels that this is really his role. He is the Catholic painter of modern science. And here is one of the first references, perhaps the first reference ever in the world of art, to the proposal that the DNA molecule has a double helix spiral shape to it. So there's a banister out here that Dali was very consciously trying to refer to the double helix shape of the DNA molecule that had been proposed in 1953. And then finally, over on the one side, there's actually a head of cauliflower, which just like all of these forms we've been looking at, rhino horns, nautilus shells, has logarithmic spirals throughout. And curiously, Dali not only is showing this because of the logarithmic spirals, but I believe it also looks very much like the top of a mushroom cloud. And there's that connection between natural order and form and also the explosion of a nuclear device in the middle of the painting. 1 year later, Dali actually meets with Generalissimo Franco, one of those notorious moments where Dali is vilified by half of his colleagues and contemporaries for meeting with the gentleman that many hold responsible for the prelude to World War II. But Dali, again, in order to remain in Spain, had to be the painter to the king or the painter to the leader, as the case may be with Franco. And as a result of this alliance, the next decade, Dali is actually given the building that eventually becomes the Dali Museum in Spain, in Figueres. 1957, Dali writes one of his least attractive books, Dali on Modern Art. Typical quote from it is this one: "Without a doubt, the worst artist in the world is called Turner." Dali goes out of his way to slander as many artists as he can, to say bad things about Picasso, Mondrian, and just about every other colleague of the 20th century other than himself. And that corresponds with the painting of the work that we have on loan to us from the museum in Fredericton, Canada, the Santiago El Grande. 1957, this is a painting where Dali said he was painting for the first time ever a celebration of the Catholicism of the fatherland. That's how he described it. And he said it gave him an existential shiver, that it was a work that competed with Raphael and potentially even belongs in the realm of Raphael. So he was certainly not mincing words when he started talking about this painting. I think he was very, very proud when he had achieved it. Originally, this was painted to be placed over an altar in a church. I don't know, I haven't read enough to know if any explanation comes as to why it did not arrive there. It possibly may have been because of money, may have been personality, whatever it was. Eventually it wound up in Lady Dunn's collection and then was given to the Beaverbrook Museum in Fredericton. But it was originally interpreted and intended to be behind an altar in a church, which seems like, in a way, a more appropriate setting. But what we have here, of course, is the rearing horse. There's a number of different symbols associated with it. This, on the left-hand side, is one of the sculptures that one would encounter along the pilgrimage to the Santiago de Compostela. It's an image of St. James as he's riding ruckshod over all of these different Moorish individuals. He was considered to be not the killer of Moors, but much worse, like the destroyer of the Moors. And that became, in a way, his celebrated attribute, is that he's the one who brought the purity back to France, which is, we all have a lot of different thoughts on that, but that was his attribute. The shell here, the scallop shell, is associated with the pilgrimage of the Santiago de Compostela. And the ceiling, very important. Well, let's go back to the original work. Looks very much like the Enigma that we have here at the Dali Museum. We're very proud of that similarity, but it really needs to be pointed out that our architects in no way, shape, or form ever saw this work. Even in reproduction, this is very rarely reproduced. It was a happy coincidence that what they arrived at resembles this great Dali painting, but it was not the model for the Enigma. In no way, shape, or form was it ever intended to be the model for it, but boy, it sure looks a lot like it. This is actually what Dali was thinking about when he painted it. It's the palmier of the Jacobeans in Toulouse. And you can see this just amazing structure that forms the top of the ceiling of this church. And you can see how that applies. Here's the bottom of the column and how it branches out at the top. Okay, moving forward, 1956, about the same period of time, maybe even just a little bit early, Dali appears for a lecture at the Sorbonne in a Cadillac filled with cauliflower. This is very typical of sort of the antics that start to be associated with the late 50s. There's not a lot of them, but there's some very good ones. So this was one. No photographs of it exist as far as I know, but there's, once again, a great cartoon drawing of a Cadillac filled with cauliflower and people enthusiastically responding accordingly. The lecture was to be about the logarithmic spiral of the cauliflower and the aesthetics of that. 1957, hopefully all of you have seen this. Dali appears on What's My Line? If you haven't seen it, you need to go to YouTube tonight on your way home and check it out. Perhaps one of Dali's most brilliant performances. It's less than 10 minutes. He answers yes to almost every question that's asked. And surprisingly, appropriately, he's not lying. Almost everyone he can say yes to. But it becomes one of those great moments where, you know, you understand the brilliance of Dali's personality in kind of controlling an audience and controlling a moment. It's just wonderful. 1958, Dali shows up at the Paris Fair with a 40-foot-long loaf of bread. So this is one of those great moments of bread getting out of control that's associated with Dali. And 1959, Dali shows up in New York City in transit with the Avosiped, which for Dali is sort of the human hamster ball that he created. The idea is that you can sit inside of it and propel your way by running against the lines inside of it. And he has this great jumpsuit design that's apparently gold with a little insignia on it. But, you know, a good kind of showmanship way to present this new concept to the modern world. And in 1958, Dali and Gala are married in the Catholic Church. Apparently, Paul Eluard, her husband, had passed away in the early 50s, allowing Dali to, through the Vatican, be allowed to finally marry his wife in a Catholic church. So they were originally married in 1934, but now finally, 1958, they have a Catholic ceremony. The Sistine Madonna is painted at the same period of time, and here you have the first kind of movement towards what becomes in the 1960s a kind of radical experimentation in art. This is another one of these large canvases. It's the second large canvas owned by the Metropolitan Museum. It's a crazy, crazy painting. It's one of my favorites. It's about 8 to 9 feet tall. There's incredible intricacy in every one of these little circles, all these little Ben-Day dots. It looks like basically an ear that's been blown up to a large proportion from a magazine, and sure enough, that is what it is. It was based on Dali seeing the Pope's ear in a reproduction in Perry Match magazine. Got really fascinated by it and started following the logarithmic spiral of the Pope's ear. And what he's actually done is created a double image with the image of the Sistine Madonna by Raphael. So there's this kind of curvature, almost ear-like, right here. And Dali's looking at the Pope's ear, and of course, the Madonna is supposedly visited by the angel Gabriel, who says the word is made flesh, she's pregnant with God's child. Here we have this nice connection between the Pope's ear, the Madonna's ear, and this sort of strange double image illusion. You can see Dali's direct connection between the paintings. It's just really kind of crazy and fun. And surprisingly, 1958 predates the Ben-Day dot paintings of Lichtenstein. So although no connection between what Lichtenstein was trying to do, certainly Dali is working in some sort of contemporary ways with these sort of odd, antiquated ideas that he's pursuing. 1958, the following year, Dali paints the Velázquez work from our collection, the Infanta Margarita, where he's celebrating the great Spanish painter, Velázquez. Again, a kind of nuclear mystical experience is behind this work. He's looking at Velázquez's painting of the Infanta, the last great work that he did. He's looking very close to it, and he says, this brush technique of Velázquez looks very much like photos of antimatter, or basically,
atoms that are being destroyed that are reproduced in the scientific journals. How interesting. Let's pursue that. And so that's what he does. You have the image of the Infanta imploding in this kind of radiant sense of color. Her head, just like with Vermeer, basically created by all these rhino horns coming together. But there is a way that she's been created where even her brooch becomes sort of the nuclear power cell that's exploding and bringing her apparition into the Prado. And the obligatory photo at the end where Dali trots his work into the Prado, gets next to the real thing, and says, you know, then and now, so to speak. It's a great photo. I love this one. 1958, Our Own Discovery of America is painted, and of course, we're not going to go into the details here, but this apparently, unless someone can find the point to contradict me, this seems to be the largest canvas Dali painted in his career, which is kind of funny because we've never really made that part of what we talk about when we talk about this work, but it seems like this is 162.5 inches. The Santiago is 161.5 inches tall. So by 1 inch, Dali outdid himself with this painting to be the largest canvas that he created. Of course, it's a reimagining of Columbus as if he was sort of a toga-clad youth, you know, in this kind of mystical dream state, and that's all deliberate. I think originally the title of this work was The Dream of Columbus, and eventually became renamed The Discovery of America by Christopher Columbus. The Dream of Columbus would have been the better title because it's certainly the more accurate description. But one of the interesting things about it is at the very bottom, of course, we have the what looks at first like a kind of sort of a celestial object or some sort of a molecular device or even you know, some sort of strange stalactite type of a thing. This is actually, it's a sea urchin. And if you remember back to one of the earlier talks when Dali's father kicked him out of the family house, he put a sea urchin on his shaved head and had the photograph. So there's a continuity here in terms of ideas. But the most important one is that it's not any sea urchin. It has a specific name, which relates to this. This, of course, is the Sputnik unmanned satellite that was launched by the Soviets in 1957 in October. This is the Sputnik sea urchin. That is actually the name of it, Sputnik, as a particular kind of urchin. It means fellow traveler in Russian, and that's what we have here, is the Sputnik sea urchin, essentially suggesting that the discovery of the New World by Columbus will be eventually repeated in the next New World in outer space. And there was a story from Eleanor Morse about how in 1969, 11 years later, she saw the moon landing, and sure enough, Neil Armstrong places his first foot onto the New World and says, one small step for man, one great step for mankind. She immediately goes to the phone, calls Dali. The response supposedly is Dali says, you know, Morse was getting better, only 11 years to figure out what Dali is thinking. You know, it seems very caustic to me whenever I think about it, but it's also very funny, you know, and it's definitely the way that they interacted with each other. So Dali's foreseeing into the future, I suppose. 1958, he also does these great images that incorporate the floret of a sunflower. So here on the left-hand side, we have the Virgin of Guadalupe with this large sort of sunflower, sun, nuclear core type of object. And then on the right side, this other incredible piece with Christ sort of in ascension, Galas, the Madonna looking down, and then the sunflower nuclear orb in the middle of that. 1959, Dali arranges for another audience with Pope John the 23rd, John Paul the 23rd. And the reason that this is important is because John Paul had just become the new Pope of the Catholic faith. Dali felt that he, because of the Ecumenical Council, was the one Pope who might be able to embrace science, modern science, with Catholic dogma. He felt that because of the kind of openness of this new Pope, that he would also be the person who could see through these kind of Dalinian enthusiastic ideas of science and mysticism as also being a dimension of the Catholic Church. Didn't really come to play out that way, but certainly Pope John Paul the 23rd was the most foresighted of all of these popes, and he met with Dali on 2 occasions. So here in 1959 they meet. Dali proposes to him that he wants to create a church in Arizona dedicated to the Ecumenical Council. Of course, that doesn't happen, but still, they do have the conversation. And then 1960, Dali paints the Ecumenical Council, which is the canvas we have upstairs celebrating the coronation of Pope John the 23rd. And the interesting thing about this, again, it goes back to Matilla. This is one of the diagrams in his book, The Curved Geometry of Art and Life, which basically applies the golden section to a Grecian urn. And what he comes out with is this grid, which is based on the square root of 5. Again, the golden section. It looks like a kind of upside-down pyramid. Dali looks at this for a while, turns it upside down, and this becomes the compositional device for our painting. So again, mathematics applied to a kind of rigorous, traditional religious painting. For Dali, this adds an extra dimension of spiritual beauty to the idea. At the same time, the most ragged image of Dali I think I've ever encountered. This is 1961. Dali dressed as Father Christmas at the Doubleday bookstore in New York City. He's also at this point engaged with bulletism, something he created where you fire bullets of paint onto canvases and use the patterns to create objects. He also creates this hand grenade that has all of these different nails in it. He puts it into a box made of copper plates. They print from that, and Dali works on the plates, and he eventually creates this image of Christ inside of the random pattern of all of those nails being smashed into the sides of it. You can see Christ's head up here. His legs are down here, going this way. His one arm goes over here, the other arm over there. It's really pretty clever. It's amazing when you look at it and you start to recognize what he was seeing. This was done as a frontispiece for this large work that was created by a number of artists called The Apocalypse of St. John in 1961. Supposedly the largest and heaviest book ever made. That's how they always sold it. I think Dali did the cover for this with all these nice forks and other objects placed into it. And then the Apocalypse is shown at the Vatican. Dali and Gala are here in this meeting. There's Dali and there's Gala, once again with Pope John Paul the 23rd. So another opportunity to meet with the Pope. So for a non-believer, he's spending a lot of time in the Vatican and doing a lot of, really substantial Catholic imagery. So it's a really sort of odd thing. It also alienated him from all of his former colleagues. The Surrealists hated him for becoming a Catholic. 1962, Dali goes in a different direction, and this kind of sets the tone for next month's talk. He starts working on a painting inspired by one of his early outmoded heroes, Mario Fortuny, who was a painter of incredible grand epics. This is a detail from a painting that's 22 feet long about this epic battle called the Battle of Tetuan. It's about the Spaniards fighting against the Arabs. Dali found it to be, on some level, incredibly moving. He did over 600 studies for this large canvas, and when he painted it, it becomes sort of a strange sort of conglomeration of Fortuny's ideas, Dali's ideas about Arabic and Spanish blood, and numerology. And what I mean by that is when you go to some of the details, this is Gala, there's Dali, there's some others, they're all made out of numbers. The longer you look at it, you start to see there's numbers everywhere in this painting. There's a 5, there's a 7, there's another 7, there's a 0, Dali's in the 2, and it's just on and on. It's like this crazy sort of taking one sort of writing system and imposing upon it another kind of representational imagery that doesn't relate and yet becomes sort of part of it. So it's very clever, it's very strange, and it sort of captures what in the 60s become a much more kind of experimental approach to painting. Where the 50s is all very religious, very much this kind of nuclear mystical experience. By the 60s, things start opening up and becoming odder and odder. 1963, Dali publishes a work that should have been published 20 years earlier, actually 30 years earlier, The Tragic Myth of Malaise Angelus. And we start to see in paintings that we'll see next month the reinsertion of the Angelus couple into different compositions, which are rather unexpected and a kind of relapse back to the Surrealist period. Of course, here we have the Angelus, 1963, Portrait of My Dead Brother, with some references to Jean-Francois Millet down in this lower half, right over here. Of course, this is the work from our collection that's in the Pompidou right now. does have this interesting connection between Dali and his brother as seen like two cherries that are connected by one stem, or this nuclear cube where the dark cherries represent the dead brother, the light cherries represent Salvador, the living brother. So he does this very complicated painting, and he also contains a double image in it where there's a large image of a black raven. You can see the eye and the beak there. And then he proceeds to call it a vulture. He says, the vulture, according to the Egyptians and Freud, represents my mother's portrait. The dark cherries created the visage of the dead brother, also named Salvador. The sunlight cherries create the image of Salvador living, thus repeating the great myth of the Dioscuri's Castor and Pollux. And Castor and Pollux were born to Leda. They were the twins. One was mortal, the other immortal. Dali's hoping he's the immortal one, hoping that his brother represents that first version that died away. But, it's a really strange process. It's just kind of taking his life and turning it into more mythological material to start working through. And so we have this blackbird that becomes a vulture here that's the mother. And when you think of it, he refers to her as Leda, but Leda was the woman. She wasn't the swan. So now she's sort of become the bird in the painting, which is very strange. And the last painting I'm going to talk about is the Daly desoxyribonucleic acid from our collection, the homage to Crick and Watson from 1963. This really brings us to the cusp of what will next month be much more all over the place. But this is perhaps in some ways the only painting I can think of that has a real sentimental core to it, in terms of the fact that there was a group of 800 Spaniards living in Barcelona who lost their lives during a particular flash flood. And this painting, which is about birth, death, and rebirth, is in a sense painted to create a sense of solace to the victims of the flood. And the painting operates basically, God the Father is up above. He's reaching down to hold his son, Christ, who at this point has died, has been buried, and is about to be resurrected into the heavens, brought back to life before the second coming. And on the left-hand side, we have a DNA molecule. On the right-hand side, Dali describes this as a salt molecule or mineral. So we have life, non-life, and then the moment of resurrection in the center. And the figure up here at the very top, that's the prophet Isaiah, who foretold the birth of Christ prior to his birth. So there's this, constant cycle of birth, death, and rebirth that's being suggested by the painting, which does indeed offer an appropriate response to the loss of life. And it's also a celebration of the moment when Crick and Watson not only have their DNA molecule recognized, but they receive the Nobel Prize as a result of their proposal. So the double helix shape of the DNA molecule becomes the molecule right here. And Dali says that there's nothing more monarchical than a molecule of DNA. Crick and Watson have legitimized hereditary monarchy as the ideal system of ordering human affairs. It was a matter of pure biology. Certainly, they don't see it that way, nor Dali says that for him, it's perfect. The DNA molecule perfectly proves the existence of Christ, or the existence of God. And then Watson, in this tape that we have, responds immediately that for him, there's no need for God anymore. It's like DNA is perfectly fine explaining all the mysteries of the universe unto itself. It's like there's no need for God anymore. So Dali's conclusion's often a little bit at odds with the scientific community, but nevertheless, that's where he goes with it. And here he describes the mineral molecule. He says it's an inorganic mineral molecule, which he describes as salt, made of soldiers pointing guns equaling non-life. He says it's kind of destruction like minerals in the process of annihilating themselves. And this is the prophet Isaiah modeled on Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling, the prophet of Isaiah. And the last thought to share with you, which brings us to 1964, and we'll conclude tonight. In 1964, Dali is awarded the Grand Cross of Isabella the Catholic, the highest Catholic distinction established by King Ferdinand in 1815 for the service of a civil nature that benefits the country. So at this point, Dali becomes, in a sense, the perfect servant of Spain that he had always wanted to be. He's recognized in that role by the government. So next month, what we're going to be looking at will be some tuna fish, We'll be talking about toreadors. We'll talk about Dali's museum, the Teatro Museo Dali, some of these strange experimental canvases that follow the ones that we looked at tonight. Look at a little bit of Dali's interest in holography and stereoscopy, and then the final years of Dali and Gala, which are really rather tragic, but that's a story for next month. So with that, thank you all for coming tonight.